Well, we are continuing the day of the Jornadas of non-classical logic of Principia in Signomon and AML, Mexican Academy of Logic. This afternoon, we have the pleasure to present Natalia Luna. She is master degree in philosophy of logic at Leeds University and candidate to PhD in Leiden University. She worked with Van Emeren, a known main reference in theory of argumentation, and she is full professor in Autonomous University of Mexico City and researcher of Principia and Signum. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, just to clarify, I am a lecturer. I wish I were a professor because professor is more like emeritus professor. Yeah, so we are lecturers. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the correction.
Cheers. Yeah, well, thank you very much for attending this talk. I work here. I taught logic for 10 years after coming back from my master's in Leeds. I was happy, but I wanted to apply my knowledge to a general public, so I decided to do a PhD on argumentation theory. Yeah, in order to take the academy outside of the philosopher's classroom. And exactly in this spirit is also this talk, which is I'm going to present our research theory. Do you hear the echo? Ah, oh, it's only me here. Okay, it's fine. And also, I was invited to relate my talk to Lorenz's second talk on violence. That's why you're going to see that this is an outsider talk. I could actually talk about the nature of logic. I would actually think that it would have been more suitable. But when I was invited to talk on argumentation and violence, I really couldn't do it because as the perspective I even studied understands it, violence is just the ending of argumentation, no? It's like the defeat of argumentation. So, but however, in life, we see that there is violence and just a small room for argumentation and for problem solving. But still, we have to work on that very small eye that we can do as philosophers. And this is my favorite motto of my favorite philosopher, Achille Barzi, which is not actually his. And it says, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. He's quoting a baseball player, coach. So this talk tries to present this talk and this research and some advances. The research project is about the argumentation as conflict management in conflict mediation. Well, there's a lot of people who have been working on that, specifically Sara Greco of la Università delle Svizzere Italiana has been doing a very good work. And my intention is to research the role that the argumentation preconditions have for this mediation. That is, when is it that you can apply a mediation framework? Well, the aims of my research is to find out the necessary argumentation preconditions for setting up the argumentative practice of mediation, to characterize argumentatively some different mediation practices, and to characterize the reframing from an argumentative point of view. And about the methodology and content is what I'm going to explain. Well, I would like to say something also before this. I would like to refer to the case of South Africa, which is a country that was not only a leader, for example, international leader in the opposition to the genocide of Palestine by the Israeli forces. As we know, they took the case to the international court and they won. So it was a very important movement. And I hear many years ago in this same space, an academic from South Africa who was actually telling us how was the mediation process, how was the mediation process. As we can remember, South Africa is a country that had a systematic racism, and then but also like a lot of terrorist attacks related to that. But at some point, the society get into account that they needed to mediate. So this academic, Joseph, I couldn't manage to remember the last name, explained that it was very, very moving. Where the mediation talks between, for example, the sons of one of the victims of a terrorist attack, and how they talk to the relatives of the other, no, the person who put the bomb. So the mediation process exists for a long time. It's a very important process, and it's not, it doesn't really need philosophy or argumentation theory, but there's been some academics who have been working on the how argumentation theory or the understanding of mediation as an argumentative process can help with the process of mediation, especially to develop like a didactic framework to do it. Well, this is an example I'm not going to read about mediation. With the, well, first, a broad definition of mediation is a broader state of incompatibility that may or may not give rise to a dispute. But in some cases, hostile action and the potential destruction of people and institutions follow to that state of dispute. From a characterization of the mediation situation that is trying to get to the argumentative point of view, we can say that in mediation, the parties are competent and responsible for the decision of the conflict. The mediator intervenes as a third neutral. She really has to be neutral, and he or she is also not held and not authorized to advance her proper standpoints or arguments in favor of a specific outcome. But her role is very, very important because she's in charge of doing of stimulate the parties to discuss reasonable, to motivate them to find a solution to the conflict, and to keep trace of the zones of agreement. Well, also from a very important one important paradigm of argumentation theories under the pragmadialectics, this developed by the Dutch school, understands argumentation as a difference of opinion, and in this way it's very it can be really used to explain the conflict in mediation. I'm going to explain this later, how they understand a discussion, the argumentation process, like composed of 4 moments, and the fourth is the confrontation stage. But I'm getting to that. Also, another, I keep characterizing this mediation situation. Well, the first, I'm just I put the same of the previous slide so we can follow it. The mediator helps the parties. Otra vez se nos fue. Bueno, helps the parties' assumption of an argumentative attitude. This is very interesting because in no other activity types in argumentation theory, I have seen that they talk about attitude. This notion that our friend Ariel Campiran has been talking about for years, and it's very important here. It's really a necessary element because how two people that are into conflict can come to a mediation situation. For example, how South Africa decide to implement these mediation processes, official, governmental. Well, because they noticed that it was useful, you know, and that's the attitude that the subject has to have to get into mediation. To really think that at least to doubt enough of his position to start the process of mediation. So this seems like managing because in successful mediation, two conflicted individuals that are entrenched in an escalating spiral of hostility can become co-arguers, able to tackle the difference of opinion by means of reasonable discussion. Just like in the spirit of what Martin Nussbaum also says, people who have critical thinking have like three very good outcomes, and one of these is that they don't see the co-arguer as an enemy. So it's just another member of your university who happens to have the opposite political point of view, no? Or is a citizen that goes to the demonstration of the opposite party, but is a Mexican, is human being, etc. So a first definition of conflict is an act of hostility between individuals, and then a second definition is propositional incompatibility. But how this notion of conflicts turned into a conflict when, for example, basically, I'm just going to summarize this saying that at some point, the propositional conflict becomes irrelevant or is forgotten, while the conflict progressively escalates, bringing the parties to decide each other elimination. No? They don't even remember sometimes what was the original conflict about, but they just recognize the adversativity. Of course, this is the process of escalation of a conflict. Okay. Well, if you understand argumentation in this way, I don't know. I really lost completely the track of time. Bueno, I think it doesn't work before. Yeah, it does. Okay. This notion of argumentation goes, of course, beyond logic. It's about the act of argumentation. It understands argumentation as a verbal, social, and rationality activity aimed at convincing a reasonable critic of the acceptability of a certain opinion by advancing one of more propositions designed to justify that standpoint. Quoting the good old Aristotle, when Aristotle is in the Analytica, he's at the business of demonstrating. So it doesn't matter how you say it, who you are, what is important is the proof and the demonstration. But when you move to the dialectics, he doesn't longer talk of true propositions, but of propositions that are plausible, or they are also translated as acceptable. So it is important then, not only the logos of the argument, both the ethos, who is presenting it, and the pathos, which is the actions of the people that are presenting them, and if the argument leads to some action. Well, what can do argumentation for mediation? Well, according to these authors, it creates an argumentative space between the parties themselves who have previously been in conflict. Then they become co-arguers and engage personally in the process of solving their conflict. The creation of such a space for argumentative discussion clearly depends on the mediator's intervention, because parties would not be able to discuss on their own as they enter the mediation process. However, this happens without the mediator engaging in argumentation directly, that is, without having him or her presenting propositions about how the conflict could be solved. This is important because we have to distinguish. For example, with legal, let's contrast. Let's contrast legal communication, which uses the prototypical genre of adjudication. So, in court proceedings, in arbitration, in summoning, on demandas, what characterizes legal argumentation is that there is always a third party who decides who's right and who solves the issue. And this is not the case in mediation. In mediation, the mediator has to have the recognition of both parties to be the mediator, but he's not going to have the verdict of who's right and who's wrong, but he has to try to lead, as I said before, to the parties of the mediation to a solution of the conflict. That it always involves, as it has been studied by Greco, a reframing of the original attitude, because if you don't reframe things, and there is not going to be any information that you can know that is going to change your point of view, but if in a way you manage to also see the other perspective in enough difference, in a strongly enough way, then you might come to a reframing of the situation, and well, this can lead, of course, to a solution, at least of a part of the conflict, or it can enable the situation to transit into a different one. Well, I jump into several slices, and what I am presenting now is the way in which prima dialectics try to explain argumentative practice. They oppose Walton, who says there is no way to study argumentation in context in general. You can only study the different argumentative practice in different contexts. So he said, no, we can find some, in the Aristotelian way, some general domains, some general genres. So for example, and they say, well, legal communication can be characterized with adjudication, political communication with deliberation, problem solving with mediation, diplomatic communication with negotiation. And I'm going to show the rest of them, which are only examples. And of course, one of these domains can make use of different genres. This is a prototypical one, but for example, I did a research on presidential election debates, and there is not only deliberation what is used, there are some other genres. Well, the other genres, but some other examples are, for example, the medical communication, which involves consultation. This is the typical genre, and it's not only we can not only see it in the doctor's consult, but also like in health brochures, in the people who work in the health domain having contact with the public. Academic communication uses the typical genre of disputation, like what we are doing now. Commercial communication uses promotion, and interpersonal communication uses communion. For example, a chat, a love letter, an apology. So the point when you are doing this is not to dispute usually, but to seek communion with the person that you are talking with. This is an interesting way of trying to give general directions for studying of argumentation. And what is interesting here is that these different practices have different degrees of institutionalization. For example, of course, the legal domain is the one that is more institutionalized. There are very clear rules of who can talk, when, what can they say. The political communication, for example, a discussion in parliament or a presidential debate has rules, but less rules. And then, of course, mediation of rules, etc. And then the last one that I was talking about, the interpersonal communication, have no rule, almost no rules, no? Well, almost, because if we really think, well, they cannot insult us directly, because then what kind of communion would be that? But in general, it's the one that is less institutionalized. So the point of what I do is to try to do an argumentative characterization of the communicative activity types, If we use like the distinction of philosophy of language between types and tokens, they say, well, in general, we can see that doctors' consultations work in that way. So they try to characterize this and to research and to write what are the institutional preconditions for that research, and those preconditions limit the strategic maneuvering that the speaker can do. And this strategic maneuvering is like what these theorics, pragma dialectics, try to add to the first theory, which is the arguers continually efforts to reconcile aiming effectiveness with being reasonable. Sorry, because I jumped some slides, I lost like the order of being very like going from the most elemental to the most difficult things. But I just would like to say that first they create just an ideal model for reasoning, for argumentation, so that they establish 10 rules, and they say fallacies are violations of these rules, and uses the standard perspective on fallacies. You could tell when something was a fallacy and when something was not. But in the extended pragma dialectics model, they try to take into account not only the dialectical aim of the speaker of trying to speak with the truth, to follow rules, to not use tricks, not to use fallacies, etc. But also with the aim of winning, because even the most expert academics wants to win, no, a discussion. So I say the speakers usually have those both aims in their minds, and they combine them in each situation by the managing of these three elements: the topical potential, that you can extend it from imagine how you can present a topic. There are many ways in which you can present a topic. For example, if you remember the first stratagem of Schopenhauer in The Art of Deceiving, he says, present your concept with the smallest spectrum. So if you're going to talk about tragedy, well, the example goes like this. The person that he was talking with says, Britain, the UK has produced a very good dramaturgs, like, because he was talking about Shakespeare, etc. And the person that answers says, oh, no, they are very, very bad in music. So he says, well, here because he's taking opera into account. So the stratagem is take the concept of your opponent in the broader sense and your concept in the most precise sense. So this is exactly a maneuvering of the topical potential, in that case of a concept. Then, of course, what the rhetoric traditionally studies, how you can present a thing, which includes the tone of voice, all the performance, and also the tropes, the use of the language, and then, of course, what the public, what the audience wants. So. Taking into account these three elements is what is gonna make the elements that are gonna basically that the speaker is gonna try to manipulate or adjust to win the situation and to try to be a good dialectician. So if you are talking to a public of academics, you would be very, very bad if you use fallacies, no? Because you know that they are not going to take you anyway. If I go to my clinic, where I am usually denied of the service, I gladly use fallacies if they are going to give me the consultation I need. Okay, so just to, I don't know how I am doing the time, but I'm going to try to close because I start to come to the time of the late. So, just to now jump to the conclusions, literally. We have seen, for example, let me put this. Yeah, it's very, very small, I apologize. That in Mexico, we can read in the newspaper that there are priests that actually work as mediators between couples of the drug dealers. We read recently that the Mayo Zambada, yeah, he was actually locked because he was treated, and he was, well, that's what the newspaper, we could read the newspaper, that he was proposed to solve a dispute between the rector of the University of Sinaloa and the head of the government of Sinaloa. Can you believe this? O sea, the couple was meant to be the mediator between the academic rector and the head of the government. And he believed that. If he believed that, I mean that it's because it's plausible, because maybe they do this. And then he was actually caught, as we could read, and he was taken to the States, no? And he's now in jail. So, what situations can actually be taken to be turned into a proper mediation? Not all the situations, but how can we distinguish between the situations that have the potential to be managed between by this means and ones that not? Well, I think for that we have to take into account the preconditions of argumentations that actually Habermas established and that Van Emeren uses as well. So you cannot engage in argumentation if there are not if the situation doesn't meet the first order conditions that belongs to the dialectic and that provide general and vital guidance for their conduct to those people who are willing and ready to act as reasonable discussions and are in the circumstances to have a critical positions. So they belong to the dialectical situation. So for example, here would be the rules of that when we talk, the other person doesn't talk, and we raise our hands to talk, etc. We are free to talk, no? In some universities, people are not free to talk. People are not free to, for example, to say their religious or political point of views. This happens in Mexico and in many countries. But this is not regarding the institution of the country, just the argumentative situation. Then the second order conditions are what Habermas called the internal conditions for a reasonable discussion, attitude, or a free mind. These are the further prerequisites for a reasonable discussion attitude that must be fulfilled to be able to comply with the first order dialectical discussion procedure. And then the third order conditions are the external conditions pertaining to the circumstances in which the discussion takes place. That's a free communicative situation. So, for example, in Iran, when the women are not even able to go out without the jihad, there is no free communicative situation, even if in the 80s they were. That doesn't mean that people don't have their point of view. They do, they just cannot express them publicly. And at last but not at least, the higher order conditions, there are the conditions pertaining to the individual. So, for example, one student once quit his job and said, I'm going to do only philosophy in life. He said, no, you need the money. You need to have a proper rest. You need to have eaten. You cannot come to the school if you don't have the minimal means. Or if we strive, for example, to get a degree without a scholarship or without a loan from our parents, well, it's difficult to get to a successful ending of the studies. So I think that all the combinations of this can determine when you can apply mediation and when not. And this is not something small. This is not something that you would call argumentative. It's actually more related to political philosophy. But I think that we really need to add it to distinguish when a situation has the potential to be mediated and when it doesn't. Well, that's my project, and well, I will appreciate all your suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. Beginning with the question, core commentary, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation that was very rich and interesting about the problem of argumentation and negotiation. I wanted to ask, because I'm not, I don't know this kind of studies, but you know also your studies, as also your colleagues, that there is also a less candid, so to say, image of argumentation and negotiation, because I am convinced that in some cases, the argumentation or also a kind of negotiation is in reality part of the conflict, okay? Because in some cases, the people have a good intention to argument and to make a negotiation. In other cases, it is a fake, okay? It is a fake, and an example is the actual argumentation in the case of Palestinian-Israeli case and Ukrainian-Russia conflict, because there are a lot of arguments that are devoted to the pacification, but at the end they feed the conflict. They present other reasons that feed the conflict. So I think that this is an important case to be studied, because there was also, do you remember, there was also a meeting that was devoted to argument about the peace, no, without Russia. that it is ridiculous. Okay, but it was done, at the end, in my opinion, it was a further feed, a further promotion of the conflict, to feed the conflict, to have new reasons, new steps of the conflict. Maybe there are also other cases, not so huge like in the case of the wars, and so also maybe between also in gossip, you know, in everyday situation. So I wanted to know your opinion, or if there are studies already about the arguments and negotiation as in reality, de facto, even if not necessarily intentionally, in some cases, the intention is to feed the conflict and as part of the conflict in reality. So they feed violence. That it is something paradoxical. Thank you.
Yeah, I would think that those type of discussions belong to negotiation, but also to political communication, no? Because they are broadcast. As any political communication, the outcome has to be decided by the party. And yeah, it's typical of the most politicians to say one thing, and we know that to imply another one. So this pretense preteritio is very used in political argumentation. Like preteritio is this thing when you say that you are not going to say something, but you say, you know, like Socrates who says in the Apology, there are some people who bring here their children to cause piety. I won't do it, even if I don't have children. So I haven't read anything of properly like the use of the argumentation as a mean for, no? As a, yeah, but that's very interesting. It's paradoxical. It's paradoxical.
But
Yeah.
you can see it is a current case.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's happened.
Thank
Yeah.
you for your
I will check on that.
other questions. No further question. You?
Okay.
I play
Viendo lo del cuadro que, más bien, este cuadro que se mostró, ¿no? Donde había aspectos políticos, diplomáticos, legales, todo eso. También está interesado por el caso de la guerra, y creo que es un conflicto altamente violento. En este caso, ¿dónde lo pondría usted? Como político, diplomático, creo que puede ser parte de ambos, ¿no?
Sí. Político y diplomático y como el fin de la argumentación. O sea, porque finalmente la argumentación es tratar de resolver un problema por medio de el intercambio de posiciones razonables. Cuando no funciona, pues se intenta solucionar de otra forma, o cuando no se quiere realmente entrar. So that was, yeah. So for me, work would be between political communication and diplomatic, but it's like, basically, I don't know how to conceptualize it from an argumentative point of view, because, as I said before, it's the defeat. Es la derrota de la argumentación.
Claro, bueno, es que sí, parte de la guerra también sería eso, ¿no? De que
Sí.
en algún momento se acaba la diplomacia, se acaba la política, la
Exacto,
organización,
sí.
pero nuevamente van a tener que sentarse en una mesa en las dos partes y van a tener que hablar de algún tipo de paz,
Sí.
una paz capitulada, condicionada, y nuevamente va a entrar un proceso de negociación.
Pues sí.
Y en este caso, por ejemplo, llevarse al contrincante con solo la violencia, pues tampoco va a garantizar nada, ¿no? O sea, no vas a llegar a ningún acuerdo posterior a la guerra.
Sí, sí tienes razón. En ese caso, pues sí sería ya política y diplomática. Sí. La mitad, sí. Gracias.
Somebody else? I have a question.
Sí.
Brief question. I am surprising with the distinction between negotiation and mediation, but happy to know that we can do a more precise notion of each of them. But I don't know, but it seems to me that the aspect of diplomatic dimension in the case of the negotiation maybe is not, or maybe will not be enough to the distinction, because I think in some cases we have a role of mediator that not necessarily with the addition of the dimension of diplomatic communication. What do you think about it? I know that.
Yeah, exactly. The mediation is more a situation where so you can be a diplomat and you generally are gonna try to negotiate for your country, etc. But maybe there can be a situation where there is a conflict between two parties and you are a neutral party. Those two parties actually recognize you as a mediator. You know? For example, Mexico and Colombia cannot be a mediator because the opposition couldn't recognize the Mexican president as a mediator. So mediation could be I think it's more in a smaller situation that, yeah, if you can see it doesn't have like the same ontological status. Yes. Because it has to be more about a situation than a domain, a situation which you have to be recognized as a mediator by both parties. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, an applause for Natalia. Thank you very much. The next and last conferences in this day is Mauricio Bieletto, and the moderation is by Alejandro Estrada.
No, después entonces me dan seguridad, ya vamos a ver. Okay, so we can start. It's a pleasure to me to introduce Mauricio Bieletto. He obtained his doctorate at the College of London University College London, and he is researcher of Sigmund Group here at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So, Mauricio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for being. Speak with the microphone for the YouTube transmission, please. Thank you very much for being with me here. First of all, I would like to say thank you to David Gaitán for having invited me to these conferences. We have worked on these topics in our seminar of, in this case, Intuitionistic logic. The seminar is more general, is about non-classical logics. And I prepared this presentation maybe 1 year ago, but I didn't have the opportunity to present this in public. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce this site from one of my favorite novels when I was a kid. It's The Never-Ending Story. I'm sure some of you know that novel. Beginning at the moment when you gave it its name, Programmer's Reply is one of the characters of the novel. It has existed forever. So be patient. I think that at the end of the talk, this is going to be clear. And I'd like to start with the notion of proof in intuitionism. You students at the back of the room know that there are logics that reject some of the principles of classical logic. In particular, they reject intuitionistic logic. It rejects the principle of the excluded term and also elimination of negation. And the motivation is that the notion of proof in intuitionistic logic is stronger than in classical logic. And this is the idea. In intuitionism, a proof of a proposition A involves providing a constructive process that shows that A is true. This process must follow logical rules and intuitionistic principles, which emphasize the idea that truth is constructed through evidence and subjective experience. So the idea is that even if you can present mathematical proofs within classical logic, if you accept intuitionistic principles, those proofs will be rejected. An intuitionistic proof is not merely limited to showing that a proposition is true, but must be constructive. That is, it must provide an explicit method or procedure for obtaining the evidence or constructing the object asserted by the proposition. I'm going to jump these references. If you need, we are going to have it anyway. Okay. Now I want to talk about a difference that sometimes they make within intuitionism. And this distinction is original by a philosopher and logician, Per Martin Love, and is between the notions of actual truth on the one hand and potential truth on the other. And the idea is that a mathematical proposition or a proposition in general is actually true when you have offered a proof of that proposition, when that proposition has been proven. On the other hand, potential truth is true if it can be proven, even if a proof has not been found yet. So let me give you some examples. Consider Fermat's last theorem. If n is an integer greater than or equal to 3, then there are no positive integers a, b, and c, such that a times n plus b times n equals c times n. That's the formulation of Fermat's last theorem. Now, before the proof in 1994, it was one of the greatest puzzles in mathematics. But now a proof of that theorem has been given. So the idea is that now that theorem is actually true. In contrast, consider Collat's conjecture. For any positive integer n, if n is even, divide it by 2, if it is odd, multiply by 3, and add 1. Repeat this process until n reaches 1. Now, the Collat's conjecture says that this process will always reach 1 for any starting value. The conjecture is potentially true. It has been verified for billions of numbers, but there is still no proof of the Collat's conjecture. If a proof is found, the Collat's conjecture will become actually true. All right? It's just a difference. Now, the motivation for this difference is because we want to compatibilize, consider these two conflicting ideas. And the distinction is going to avoid the conflict between these two ideas. First, mathematical truths are dependent on human construction of proof, as intuitionism says. But on the other hand, mathematical truths are timeless and unchanging. It's an intuition we have ingrained, perhaps inside of us, that mathematical truths are eternal. Okay, so if we appeal to this distinction, we could say that this distinction recognizes that while mathematical truths may be eternal, our knowledge and understanding of them are often time-bound. Just because a mathematical statement is potentially true doesn't necessarily mean that we have a proof for it at any given moment. By distinguishing between actual and potential truth, intuitionism allows for the possibility that a proposition is true even if we don't have a proof of it yet, while acknowledging that the potential for truths beyond our current understanding. Intuitionism still maintains its core principle that mathematical knowledge is grounded in constructive proofs. All right? This is a motivation, one of the motivations for distinguishing between actual and potential truth. But there's a problem. The problem is presented in a paper by Martino and Usberti of 1994. But I'm going to give a paraphrasis of that objection, and this is the idea. If we want truth to be tenseless, it is necessary that also the notion of possibility, in terms of which its notion is defined, is conceived of atemporal. So, as long as we identify truth with probability and agree with traditional intuitionism that the probability of A subsists only by virtue of our actual proving A, we cannot agree with a Platonist that a mathematical statement, if true, is timeless truth. This is the first part of the objection. It seems that this distinction, after all, implies something that the intuitionist doesn't like: the postulation of a Platonist realm of mathematical truths and mathematical proofs. And this is against intuitionistic principles. And the second objection is that if potential truth is seen as a possibility that exists independently of whether a human subject can construct a proof or not, this leads to the idea that there is an objective realm where this proof exists, waiting to be found. In such a view, potential truth is not dependent on the mathematical creative process or knowledge, but exists regardless of human condition, which is against intuitive principles. Okay, yes, sorry. And the second objection is the notion of potential truth implies that truth and proof exist outside the realm of human knowledge, as the possibility of constructing a proof does not depend on the mathematical's current epistemic state. This contradicts the intuitionist notion that truth is always tied to what can be known and constructed by a subject, making potential truth seem more like a classical rather than an intuitionist notion. Okay. So the first problem is that if we appeal to the intuitions of intuitionism, to the principles of intuitionism, we don't want to accept our Platonic realm of mathematical truths and mathematical proofs. Now, if you remember, if you have studied how Gödel develops his famous proof, you know that he formalize the notion of proof in such a way that this notion can be represented within within arithmetic itself. A proof in this formal sense is a finite sequence of symbols that follow from axioms according to specific rules of inference. Now, this formalization is intuitionistically acceptable because it aligns with the constructive nature of intuitionism. A proof is a finite, concrete object that can be built step by step from the axioms of a system like Peano's arithmetic. Now, in intuitionism, truth must be tied to the ability to construct a proof, not to the existence of some abstract, non-constructive entity. But Gödel's formalization respects this because a proof in his sense is not floating in some Platonic realm. It is a well-defined, algorithmically generable object based on explicit rules. Therefore, as long as we can construct proofs in this way, we don't need to appeal to a Platonic conception of proofs. The notion of proof as a formal object is something that intuitionism can accept because these proofs are concrete and can, in principle, be constructed. Now, of course, the problem is that the notion of proof in Gödel's sense is limited to arithmetics. And of course, you can ask, well, what happens with the other realms of mathematics? Now, the idea is that, okay, remember this famous tale of Jorge Luis Borges about the Library of Babel. The Library of Babel contains books filled with every possible combination of 25 basic characters, 22 letters, the period, the comma, and the space. Most of these combinations are random, are nonsensical, but given the magnitude of possible combinations, the library necessarily contains every coherent text ever written or that could be written. Of course, you also could say, okay, but remember that classical intuitionism says that mathematics is really not a process of giving results in a language. Mathematical results are within the mind of the mathematicians. So perhaps you can tie the notion of proof with something linguistic like the books inside the Library of Babel. But consider this idea, the digital version of the Library of Babel. The digital version of the Library of Babel possesses a near infinite repository of files, each containing a unique sequence of bits, zeros, and ones. The sequences in these files could be converted into text, images, audio, or any other form of digital content, depending on how they are interpreted. The idea of the digital library of Babel suggests that while proofs might not exist in a Platonic metaphysical sense, they are still out there in a combinatorial sense, which aligns constructivist and intuitionist principles. All proofs are formally encoded and potentially findable in the digital library through a constructive process. So we don't need to postulate a metaphysical strange Platonic meaning of proofs that exist independently of us. The library is just a vast collection of sequences generated through a mechanical combinatorial process. There's nothing mystical or metaphysical about it. It's just the result of exhaustive combinations of finite sequence of symbols. So perhaps we can address in this way objection 1. Gödel's proofs are not abstract Platonic entities. They are formal sequences of symbols that can be generated by following concrete rules. They exist within a system defined with the mathematicians, grounded in the axioms and inference rules they choose. The Library of Babel analogy shows that even though we might not know a proof exists, it is not because that proof resides in some unreachable timeless realm. Instead, the proof exists as part of a constructive process, the generation of all possible sequences. Thus, the idea that potential truth involves proofs that are out there doesn't force us into Platonism. The proofs are not in some abstract, inaccessible realm, but rather in a set that the mathematician can constructively define. How can address objection to? Have you ever played Minecraft? If you remember, a seed in Minecraft is a unique code that you introduce at the beginning of the game that determines a specific generation of a world. This code dictates the arrangement of terrain, placement of structures within the game, distribution of resources, and other elements that make each world distinct. Once the seed is given as an input, the world generation process follows certain predefined algorithms to create a consistent and reproducible environment based on that seed. Now, there's an analogy. When a mathematician chooses axioms and rules, it is like selecting a Minecraft seed. The choice of the seed is a creative process that determines the structure and characteristics of the Minecraft world, just as the choice of axioms and rules determines the structure and truths that will follow in a mathematical system. This process does not involve discovering something external or pre-existing. It shows how a set of truths can be constructed based on the mathematics' initial choices. Now, while potential truths are proofs are constructible within the system established by the mathematicians, they are not immediately known or available to the mathematicians due to human cognitive limitations. The fact that a proof may exist, even if the mathematicians have not yet discovered it, reflects the mathematician's lack of omniscience, not the existence of a separate, independent realm of mathematical entities. So, I think this is how we can address objection to. Potential truths are not known because the mathematicians has not yet derived or constructed a proof. This aligns with the idea that mathematicians are not omniscient and that the consequences of their actions and rules are not fully apparent. But despite being unknown, these truths are still dependent on the mathematician's knowledge, because the structure of possible truths is entirely determined by the original axioms and rules the mathematicians choose. The potential truths are not knowledge independent in a Platonic sense, as though they exist timelessly in some abstract field, but rather they are grounded in the constructive choices made by the mathematicians. Conclusions. The notion of potential truth is compatible with intuitionistic principles. Truths are potential in that they are latent within the system, but must be brought into actuality by the mathematician's constructive efforts. Now, it avoids the problem of Platonism while maintaining a clear link to the mathematician's knowledge. And these are perhaps extended conclusions. When mathematicians define a formal system to set a seed, the potential consequences and proofs of this system are determined by these foundational elements. The system structure and the set of potential truths are established as soon as the actions and rules are set. For the moment the seed, that is the initial set of actions and rules, is in place, the truths and proofs that arise from it can be seen as eternal within that system. They are fixed and immutable, just like the terrain in a Minecraft world when the set is set. This eternal nature is not due to an external grid of truths, but rather as a consequence of the system's internal properties. And perhaps at the end of the day, you can now understand why I choose this initial passage in the never-ending story. Beginning at the moment when you gave it its name, when you give the seeds, when you give the actions, the proofs, and the truths has existed forever. Well, thank you very much. That's
So can we have time for questions, answers, comments, objections? So, okay, Alicia?
Well, I like very much.
thank you.
Maybe we can make well, there are two things I want to say. One is, I think there maybe establish a difference between two kinds of constructions, or that's better to say, two kind of defining the construction. If you define the construction as a potential process of human being, this will depend on whether we human beings have the capability to construct it. And we may not.
Yes.
We are not so smart as to use mathematical or logical system and build a proof. So if you define it using the idea of human capacities, you won't be sure that mathematical or logical truth is a potential truth until the moment we build it. The other possibility is not, and I think you are thinking about this possibility, is not to ground the proof on the capability, but just on the possible combinations of the rules of the system. So potential truth is something that the system have by himself the capability to construct, to just to follow the rules. And no one of these two alternatives will postulate Platonic entities, but one is, I think, better, and I think you were thinking about that. And well, the other things I have adopted about the conjecture.
Yes.
Yes. I didn't understand if this conjecture, Collat's conjecture, may be proved or not, because usually when something is a conjecture, we don't know if it can be proved or not. And if we don't know if there is the possibility in the system, this is not a potential truth. We don't know it is a potential truth until the moment it is proved. Unless you know a precedent that we have not followed yet, but we know there is a precedent to prove this will be proved if we have any time or something like that. Yes, but something that is a conjecture not necessarily is potentially a mathematical truth.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so let me think first about your second commentary, and the idea is you say that Collat's conjecture is not even potentially true because we still don't know if we can find a proof or not. That's the idea, no? So, okay. Okay, perhaps it's something that I still need to think more about. But of course, we still don't have reasons to think that Collat's conjecture is something like those mathematical truths that perhaps are truths but not provable. So yes, in that sense, maybe we could say that it is still not even potentially true. Yes. And the other idea was
between human process of constructions
uh-huh.
and
Of course. And related to that, of course, we also have to establish the difference between the things that are potentially true, but only in the sense that we don't have mathematical reasons for proving or not. And the other idea is maybe there are empirical reasons, perhaps the world is going to end tomorrow, and we are not going to prove anything more because there's an empirical reason. And of course, that should be taken into consideration when we make these distinctions. Thank you.
Here we have. Okay, no, four questions more. So, microphone for you.
Oh,
So, Professor Lorenzo,
Quick
Jesus,
question.
Natalia, and Aristides.
My philosophical love for mathematics is a bit platonistic. I think I agree with your presentation because it is related also to a kind of naturalization of the status of mathematics. But anyway, I think there is also a character of mathematics that I could call quasi-Platonic, pseudo-Platonic, and it is the fact that when it is, of course, knowledge-dependent and human product, but the result is necessary.
yes, yes.
So, you cannot say, okay, but I prefer a square with five sides. In philosophy, you can say, I prefer Leibniz. I prefer the concept of monad. I do not like the concept of Plotinus. Okay, but in mathematics, the product is over there. I say, using a psychoanalytical metaphor, it is anti-narcissistic, so to say. And I think that this is a kind of quasi-Platonic character. Don't you agree?
Yes, of course. And this is something I didn't address in the talk. The idea that mathematical truths are not only eternal, and that sounds strange, really. I think it is more interesting to say that mathematical truths are necessary. And I didn't address that in the talk because I didn't have time. But I thought of this. Okay, think again about this idea of the analogy between Minecraft scenes and the fact that mathematicians propose axioms and rules that were when they are building their systems. Now, of course, if we perhaps have a very naive intuitionist position, we could also say that no, not even mathematical truths are necessary. But I don't agree with that. They say that with age, you become more and more conservative. Well, I don't know. I'm almost 50 years old, and I agree with you. Mathematical truths are necessary. But let me say this. Maybe what we can say is that this necessity is found within this postulation of axioms and mathematical rules. And that's the creative part on the side of mathematician. He gives that seeds, he gives the axiom, he gives the rules. But necessity is beyond the mathematician. It's something that he needs to accept when axioms and rules are given. And in that sense, perhaps it's a way to say within an intuitionistic position that you can agree with the existence of mathematical truths as necessary. I don't know if you agree. I know I didn't address this particular topic in the talk. I was thinking about that, but thank you for for mentioning that because it's really, really important and perhaps is a much more present problem than the idea that mathematical truths are eternal. Yes, eternal. Yes. It's maybe interesting, but the really interesting point is the idea that mathematical tools are necessary. Yes. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Mauricio.
Yes.
Great.
My first question is, why math works to explain mathematical units? Okay, my point is about ontology of mathematics. Okay, I think the subject is so interesting, and according to Intuitionism and potential truth, there are two standard points. Firstly, does the language of mathematical structure are they not a mathematical reality? Or are they syntactic signs that they little or nothing to do with any reality? Okay, maybe. So for the intuitionism, the point is how the mathematicians think. Okay, and if that is the point, and the mathematician's content allows some mathematical ontology as one kind of mathematical agency. That's my question. What do you think about that? Why math works?
How math works?
Why math works?
Why math works? Okay. It's a very, very difficult question to tell you the truth. How math works within the context of intuitionism?
Yeah, to explain events that events is not in principle mathematical events.
For instance,
Physical events.
the movement of the wind,
Yeah,
twister,
etc.
storm, the movement of the planets surrounding the sun.
Whatever.
Okay, again, I think it's a very, very difficult question. I really don't know how to answer that right now. Again, sometimes I consider myself also a realist.
Yeah.
I just try to show that this distinction between potential truth and actual truth can be, after all, and in spite of the objections of Martina Busberti, compatible with intuitionism. But of course, what happens with this mathematical reality if physical events instantiate mathematical reality, and how mathematics can really be or can model those physical events, or how mathematics can help us to understand how these events work, even if we don't consider mathematical truths part of a Platonic realm. Again, is something that it is really very difficult for me to answer right now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I think my conclusions here are very, very limited, just related to the compatibility of a distinction within intuitionism. Of course, your question is very, very interesting, but I really need to think a little more of how to address your question.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So,
We have Susie Natalia.
Thank you, Mauricio, for the talk. I really like it, but I kind of have this sense that we are putting a donkey below behind the chart.
okay.
I would like to call the philosophers of science and to try to recall the discussions about the scientific realism and whether there is a scientific reality there, and also, of course, the doubts and criticisms of those positions, no? That is not the social reality, that is, I don't know, there's position. So in philosophy of logic and philosophy of mathematics, you can really see those debates about the ontological status of logical entities or logical properties. This is something I wanted to tell to Alicia in the morning as well. So the question about if whether mathematical truths are necessary or not, are potential or actual, could also be understood as a metaphysical or as a Christian question. But I think that's a consequence of how we posit logic or mathematics and mathematical entities. So we should answer first, I think, the ontological question of I am a realist regarding mathematical entities. If that is, so then there are epistemic consequences. And if that's not the case, there are also there are consequences for the positions of monisms and pluralisms in logic. The ontological step, let's say.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. And I have a confession to make. I think myself as a realist, to tell you the truth. And you would say, well, why are you then doing something about intuitionism? Because I also a contextualist in logic. I think that these logical alternatives, these systems, these alternative systems, these non-classical logics, have a very great range of application. But we do not need to buy the realist metaphysical position in order to work with intuitionistic logic. I mean, it is really a very strange position, idealism. And I remember that in the seminar we were talking about that. But this is my idea. This distinction could help us to address some problems in philosophy of logic related to intuitionistic logic. And we can say that we can accept the idea that truths are after all eternal and perhaps necessary. But at the same time, we can still use intuitionistic logic. And I think that's very important. I know the motivations for intuitionistic logic were at the origin very metaphysical, very strange, and also very interesting, but very controversial. And again, I think we can reject those motivations and still use intuitionistic logic, for instance, in computation. Sometimes it's very useful, but we don't need to buy the whole world of intuitionistic motivations in order to love intuitionistic logic and to use it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's, thank you.
I just wonder if you are consistent.
Okay, thank you. I need to think a little more about that. I thought I was, but it's something that I need to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we have the last question of this conference. So, is this?
No. I said there is the last question. Was a description.
Okay.
Voy a intentar ser lo más breve posible. Ahorita que estabas hablando de las motivaciones, pues por una parte mencionabas esto, ¿no? Las verdades matemáticas no tendrían el calificativo de eternas. Y lo que acabas de mencionar con Natalia, ¿no? Las motivaciones intuicionistas. Ahora, quisiera preguntarte, bueno, si también hay alguna razón epistémica dentro de su trabajo. Y bueno, lo siguiente sería, ¿qué se ganaría con esta práctica en la matemática?
Bueno, primero que nada, no creo estar diciendo que las verdades lógicas, perdón, matemáticas no sean verdades. De hecho, precisamente esa fue una de las ideas que traté de poner al inicio de la plática. con esta sugerencia de este pequeño pasaje de la historia interminable. Son eternas en el momento en que las defines. En el momento en que tú pones la semilla de Minecraft, lo que se vuelve eterno es el mundo de Minecraft, en el sentido de que si tienes esa semilla, no puedes tener otro mundo. Y en ese sentido también estás hablando de la necesidad de ese mundo a partir de esa semilla. Y de la misma manera estás hablando de la necesidad de las verdades matemáticas a partir de los axiomas y de las reglas que usas con esos axiomas. Pero donde el intuicionista sí puede tener razón es en la idea de que ahí hay creatividad por parte del matemático. Porque el matemático pudo haber elegido otro conjunto de axiomas, pudo haber elegido otro conjunto de reglas, y entonces el conjunto de verdades matemáticas también. Pero esas verdades matemáticas son necesarias a partir de las semillas, es decir, de los axiomas y de las reglas propuestos por el matemático. Y en ese sentido también serían eternas. ¿Por qué? Porque en el momento en que las creas, en el momento en que tú das los axiomas y das las reglas, ese conjunto de verdades matemáticas ya no cambia. Cambiaría, por supuesto, si cambias los axiomas y las reglas. Pero eso es otra cosa. Estás cambiando el juego. Dentro del juego, tú llegas a un conjunto de verdades necesarias y en ese sentido eternas. No sé si tiene sentido lo que estoy diciendo. A mí me parece que tiene mucho. Pero quizá muchos me digan, no, aquí hay, como dice Natalia, a lo mejor una incompatibilidad. Si lo creen así, ayúdenme a ver. Pero yo en este momento no la veo.
Pero mira, si me permites ahorita hablar en español como Aristides, te lo he seguido un poco. Hay ciertas verdades en matemáticas que no... A ver, todo también depende del concepto de matemáticas que tú tengas. ¿Ves? Si tú piensas que el mundo de las matemáticas está dividido por... O sea, tú dirías, en cada caso estaríamos hablando como de ciertos objetos, ¿no? O de ciertas verdades que son eternas para cada caso. Sin embargo, a la hora de cuando nosotros estamos haciendo pruebas matemáticas, ¿sí? Sí hay una inconsistencia cuando tú dices, o hay al menos un problema, cuando tú estás diciendo que en una estructura matemática hay una generalidad en contenido profesional matemático y no en otro. No en otro. Entonces, who's know what is the best? Si me estoy explicando, ahí es cuando creo que puede surgir un problema interesante para tu punto de vista, para un intuicionista. O sea, un intuicionista tendría que decir un poco esto de hecho en activo es lo que está pasando en matemática teórica.
Bueno, ahí sí déjamelo de tarea. Tengo que pensar un poco.
Es un poco lo que
pero
Aristides estaba diciendo.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much. And
We now relays this session with the words of Natalia Luna, the president of Lógica.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you very much for conferences in this day. It was a day with a lot of interesting proposals. And we have a recess the day of tomorrow, but the Thursday we conclude with the last session of the Jornadas. And gracias Gabriela. Gabriela bring with us with all her students. And this event is a result of a combination of various aims and institutions and groups. Then we have support of the Philosophy College and Faculty of Philosophy of here in UNAM. But also we have a very great support with the Autonomous University of Mexico City. And we have the last session of the Jornadas in the laboratory, philosophical laboratory, in the sede of San Lorenzo de Sonco of Autonomous University of Mexico City, the Thursday, and we begin at 10:30, I think, and in the laboratory with the seminar, the second session of seminar of Lorenzo Mañana, and then a closure conference for thereafter. We wait all of you can to accompany to us in that last session. Thank you.